Hi there, everyone. Today we're looking at our final aspect of the Gilded Age, looking at the lower class of society. We'll break it up into a few parts. But today we're looking at the farmers and farmer discontent and what will be the growth of the Populist Party eventually to try to address that farmer discontent that we see at this era. And farmers are struggling for a couple of reasons. What they've done after and during the Civil War is adopt all of that much more efficient machinery to be able to produce much more. And I'll show you an image of what that machinery looks like. This is where we are at this point. By the end of the century, we'll start to have some internal combustion engine tractors, but mostly it's still horse drawn. But still, we realize how big of a machine this is. And what an investment this would be. The equivalent today of hundreds of thousands of dollars in horses and in machines. And notice the size of it too. This is going to mean that you have to do it really in a large scale to be able to make this purchase and to do it efficiently then. This is not something you're going to do on a small plot and keep turning around frequently. So this is going to be the beginning of large scale agriculture in the United States. And it's really efficient. It works really well. It does constrain things a bit. It's good for a large farm. It requires a large investment. It's good for a single cash crop. And so it will be the end of those small self-sufficient farms where you're growing all sorts of things to feed yourself and perhaps your neighbors. Now you're growing one thing, wheat or corn, shipping it to a place like Chicago, but growing it in really large quantities. And for basic supply and demand, that means if you grow a huge amount, and American farmers will grow a huge amount, prices go down. That is general supply and demand, is that we become so efficient at producing so much, prices start to drop. Of course, that's bad news for the farmers producing them. We also see the railroads we've talked about before charging very high rates, especially in rural areas where there is no competition, and hence they can charge kind of whatever they want. At the same time, government has imposed high tariffs, and this is, of course, a familiar story to US2 students. This was the same thing back in US1, part of the divisions between the North and the South, those high protective tariffs. They're good for industry, mostly along the eastern coast, the Northeast. But before, whereas it was mostly a North-South divide, now we will see more of an East-West divide as that large-scale farming moves west onto the Great Plains. And so there's this general feeling between the railroad companies, between the government who is imposing these tariffs, is that everyone's taking advantage of the little guy, the farmer, and that the farmer is really getting the bad end of both of these deals. And so they feel they are being taken advantage of by the wealthy, the powerful, the well-connected. At the same time, they have a huge amount of debt because of the machinery that they needed to be able to harvest all of these crops and the land they had to purchase as well to be able to run those machines efficiently over large farms. So they have huge debts to try to pay back as they try to keep up with everyone else. And then we have deflation. And this is what makes it very difficult for them. Deflation means the price for things is slowly going down. And it's the opposite of what we're used to. We usually have slow, small inflation, the opposite of deflation. And inflation means the price of everything goes up a little bit. And the example I've always liked to use was omelets in the cafeteria because I used to love those omelets, especially 2 years ago. You might remember, I think it was 2 years ago when they were really pretty substantial meals, those omelets. And they cost $4.25, and you even got a small coffee with it. Then last year, the omelets got a little bit smaller and the price went up. But that's pretty typical. I don't think people were that shocked by it. This is what always seems to happen. That's inflation. The price of things goes up a little bit. The problem is if you're in debt, that really makes, when we have deflation, much more challenging because now the things that you're selling, the price has gone down. You're getting less money for the wheat that you are selling, and yet you've got to pay back the same dollars, same number of dollars to the bank for your loan. And so you're bringing in less money, but you are also having to pay even more. And so that makes it really difficult. Again, to use that omelet analogy, imagine if we had deflation and the price of that omelet went from $4.25 to just $4. And I might be happy about that. But of course, we have to consider the person selling the omelets. Would the cafeteria, the company that runs the cafeteria, would they be happy if the price went down? Of course not. And especially if, let's say, they had taken out a loan to buy all those little fancy grill things that they have for making the omelets. If they had taken out those loans, they've got to pay back all the money that they invested to make the omelets, but now they're getting less money for each omelet they sell. We can maybe see how challenging that would be for them. And so again, deflation is that decline in prices because of a relative decrease in the money supply. If there's less dollars around, those dollars become more valuable, and that will lead to deflation then. And a lot on this slide, but what we see here is, first off, the US population during the Gilded Age has gone up enormously, mostly from immigration. But there's not a whole lot of money. There's not a big increase in money in circulation. And so what that means, if there's more people all wanting money, but the same absolute number of dollars, it's again that supply and demand. We've got more demand, no more supply. And so the value of each dollar is going to go up. So instead of the typical inflation where the dollar becomes less valuable and buys fewer goods in the future, we have deflation, which makes the dollar more valuable and buys more goods. And again, that's good for the consumer to be able to buy more goods in some ways, although it complicates things quite a bit. This is very bad for people in debt because they have to repay loans with more valuable dollars than what they borrowed. And that's what we see in the graphic in the top right, is that the debt seems much larger. You still owe technically the same number of dollars back, but it seems much more difficult. It seems like a bigger payment. So the farmers are struggling. They have deflation. They are being foreclosed. That's what happens when you can't pay back the bank. They come and take back the land or your house or the farm in foreclosures. And this is a bit of a national crisis. This is, again, part of what made America America, is the idea of the small farmer, the idea of owning your own land. This is what attracted so many to the United States. And that's becoming more and more rare. More and more whites are becoming tenant farmers, sharecroppers, which we've talked about before, not owning their own land. And this is, of course, a huge disappointment for people who have come with that expectation that this is what they're going to be able to do, is own their own farm. And that's becoming impossible, it seems. And so they're looking for someone to blame. And they will blame the bankers, they'll blame Wall Street, they'll blame the big industries back east, the railroad companies, and also the government, who they see as working hand in hand with those corporations at their expense. And so the farmers will try to come together and try to mobilize and make some changes. But it's difficult. They are about half the population in 1890. This is a steadily declining percentage, though. Again, because of that mechanization, you need fewer workers to produce the same amount of food because you have all these machines to do the work for you. And so in 1890, it's still about half the population, about 50%, but it's tough to organize. They are by definition rural, and they're spread out over a huge territory. And so communication is difficult. Again, increasingly losing their land. By about 1890, 25% of farmers don't own their farm anymore. They are renting it as tenant farmers or sharecroppers. African Americans, that was largely true after the Civil War, increasingly for whites as well. There's a few attempts early on to try to organize. The Grange is the first one. And this is more of a social movement to try to at least bring together some of these farmers. They don't have big political ambitions at that point, but it lays some of the groundwork of cooperation between farmers that will be necessary for the next step. And trying to work together. Co-ops, that means they're owning it together rather than a company owning something like the silo and the warehouse that will be so essential for a farmer to store their crops. They will try to own it collectively together. and come together. And again, that cooperation, that's going to be so key. Next step is the Farmers Alliance. And this again is more political than the Grange to try to actually get some laws passed, but it's going to be difficult. Another big division among farmers is race. And keep in mind, this is an era when whites and blacks are unable to sit next to each other. To get them to work together in a political organization, that's going to be a challenge because of the racism that exists at the time. But then they will start to come together by 1892 with the Populist Party. And we're going to look a little bit closer at the Populist Party together, but we'll do that back in class. So let me end off there, and I'll see you in class.